Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Today I have another theory-based video and I want to talk again about the writing style of historical fencing treatises, which is to say the original period texts that we use to research the modern revival of historical styles of swordsmanship. These texts are, of course, difficult to understand and interpret for modern readers for a variety of reasons. But I want to focus in on one particular reason today, and that is the use of seemingly contradictory language within many texts. So what's going on here? Are these authors hypocrites? Do they not know what they're talking about? I don't think so. Any fencing master that was in a position to publish a book in the early modern period must surely have been successful to some degree, possibly to a great degree. So in my opinion, we have to assume that they knew what they were talking about. So I'm going to go through a few simple examples of contradictions from Italian fencing treatises. I do believe that you'll find similar things in other cultures' fencing treatises as well, but Italian fencing is my speciality, so I'm going to focus on that. So without further ado, let's get into our first example, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go along. So the first treatise I want to talk about is this one. So it's the work of Filippo Vadi, which was published sometime in the 1480s. And the contradiction in this one is relatively simple, I think. In his introduction, Vadi states something along the lines of, "I esteem only the two-handed sword, and I use this weapon for all purposes or in all situations." Something like that. But at least half of his treatise is dedicated to weapons which are not two-handed swords. So they are spears, poleaxes, daggers, things like this. So this clearly looks like a contradiction, and Vadi's work was clearly targeted and specifically targeted at the knightly classes. And in the 1480s, it is unthinkable that knights would not use single-handed swords from time to time alongside other weapons like the two-handed sword. So Vadi presumably did use all these other weapons because he was teaching them. Is this hypocrisy here? No, I don't think so. I think Vadi was just making an overly dramatic point that he believed the two-handed sword was the ideal weapon, the optimal weapon for personal combat. Or perhaps it was just as simple as him saying, "It's my favorite weapon." So I don't believe this was contradiction. I think he was just trying to get his readers to understand that this should be your first choice if you had a free choice of all weapons. But of course you should and would have to use different weapons in different circumstances. So that's the first example of a contradiction. The second one I want to talk about is from Camillo Agrippa's treatise of, I believe, 1553. This one is a more technical point. So Agrippa states fairly clearly in his Principles of Fencing that you should avoid parrying at all costs. He says that you should defend yourself either by slipping blows or by performing counter-time attacks. That seems like quite an extreme position to take when it comes to fencing tactics. So his reason for this is that when you parry an opponent's attack, you are really doing what the opponent wants, because you are reacting to his move rather than seizing control of the fight. And he obviously sees that as being a bad thing. So for Agrippa, The parry was maybe the worst option or the weakest option when it comes to defense. I do not believe at all that Agrippa never parried when he fenced. And I don't really think he expected the readers of his treatise never to parry. I think what he was doing here when he says you shouldn't parry is just to get his students to remember that the parry is the weakest or the worst option. And if possible, they should try to perform a counter-time defense or slip blows. So that's my interpretation of what Agrippa was saying here. I don't think he was a hypocrite either. I think he was, again, exaggerating for dramatic effect so that his students or his readers went away thinking, yeah, I should try to parry less and implement these alternative defenses. The final example I want to cover today is quite a well-known one. It's from Ridolfo Capofero's treatise of 1610. In fact, there are two elements of contradiction that I want to discuss from this, but I think he actually has quite a few other examples of this. The first one, which is maybe the most obvious when you read the book, is in his introductory section, so the first part of his book, he talks about how bad feints are. He describes them as being a vanity, says that they don't really serve any purpose, and generally advocates his reader not to use them. Okay, so he seems to be saying that they're a bit dangerous or a bit silly. But then in the second part of his book, where he provides example plays, almost every play that he shows includes at least one feint option. And in fact, he quite regularly states that if such and such a fencer were wise, he would use a feint at this point. So the language here is clearly a contradiction. On the one hand, feints are a useless vanity, but on the other hand, wise people use feints. I mean, that clearly seems like hypocrisy. But once again, I believe that in the first part of his book, what he's really trying to say is that you should not use feints all the time when you're fencing. It's not a standard technique. It's something you use in particular tactical situations only, like the ones described at the back of the book. So I think when he says feints are a vanity, what he's saying is that a lot of fencers just use them without thinking about it, and this is dangerous. The second contradiction in Capofero's book is when he's talking about guard stances and their tactical use. So he says something like, terza is the only guard. But he clearly and very specifically describes other guard postures which you can use. So there are 4 key ones of prima, seconda, terza, quarta, plus several other variations of these more special guards that are used in certain situations. I, again, do not believe for a second that Capofero only ever fenced from terza guardia. I think when he says terza is the only guard, he's exaggerating once again. He's trying to tell you that terza is the only completely defensive posture which you can use in this style. The other guards are only partly defensive, but they have more offensive capabilities than terza. So my interpretation of terza as the only guard is in fact terza is the only truly defensive guard. And that reconciles that statement with all of the example plays that we can see in the rest of his treatise. So once again, we have a statement which is an example of exaggeration for dramatic effect. In other words, hyperbole. So to summarize, I believe that historical fencing authors often used hyperbole as a teaching tool to really hammer home the key points and key principles of their systems. So when they seem to be contradicting themselves, when they come to other parts of their book, I don't think it's a real contradiction. I think we should not necessarily take every statement in a treatise literally. Of course, it's hard for us as modern readers to differentiate between things which should be taken literally and things which are exaggerations. But deciding which is where the interpretation aspect of historical fencing research comes in. So that's something that I hope you can take away, think about a little bit, and bring into your own research if you are trying to decode or read historical fencing treatises of your own. So yeah, that's the point I want to make today. I have certainly taken this idea into my own research in De Grassi's treatise, which is actually the main one that I use in my own fencing club. Which fencing treatises do you think contain examples of hyperbole? On that note, I'll finish up there for today. Take care, everyone. See you soon. Bye for now.